Hello, friends. I'm Mike, and welcome to Chosen to Love. In the best of times, it's nice to be able to share stories with people because that's how you really get to know people, is by hearing what they've been through and what they've gone through and what has brought them to this point in their life. But there's no greater time, no greater moment for our stories than when people are in a season of fear, a season of uncertainty, a season of panic. Because our stories tell people we've been here before, we'll get through it just like before. In this season of uncertainty, the power of our stories lies in the hero of our story. The hero of our story is God. And you know why he's the hero? Because he never changes. In a season where everything is changing from moment to moment, he never does. And so, one of the greatest things that we can do for people, especially now in this season, in this time, is share our stories of the God who works in the impossible. So today I'd like to share my story with you guys. You see, I was born on January 25th, 1981. It was Super Bowl Sunday, and let's just say the doctors were more interested in a football game than they were in giving birth to me. In fact, one doctor wasn't even paying attention when he administered a pair of cervical injections to my mom. In fact, he administered 3 shots. And he missed my mom and hit me in the brain and my mom's stomach with all 3 shots. When I was born, the doctors saw this and they thought, ooh, that's not good, but you know what? We're going to send him home anyways. Well, that actually had an effect on me. At 11 months old, I would go blind in my left eye. I'd have 2400 vision in my right eye. And I started having to wear very strong glasses from a young age. And then things started to get a little bit worse the older I got. Around the age of 2.5, I started regressing. I had been potty trained. That's good, right? And I had learned some basic skills, but all of a sudden I found that I was, wetting the bed. And every time I would sit down, I would scream and hold my head. I was in tremendous pain. So in desperation, my mom started taking me around to the hospitals in the area where we lived in Minnesota. And the doctors kept telling her the same thing over and over again. You're just a nervous first-time mom. He's just a young boy that wants attention. Ignore him. But my mom realized that what was going on with me was not normal. And so she took me in a desperate attempt to a doctor who was willing to give me a CAT scan. And the doctor told her, listen, lady, I'll give your son a CAT scan and then I would never want to see or hear from you again when it comes back negative. Well, they sat her outside the observation room. They put me into the CAT scan, and they were making fun of her through the door when all of a sudden the room went quiet and they started running out. The doctor that had been making fun of her came out, got down on his hands and knees in front of my mom, and he said, ma'am, I'm so sorry. We just found a level 4 malignant brain tumor the size of a golf ball in your son's brain, and it has now exploded with finger-like tentacles stretching through every part of his brain. We're going to call the world's leading neurosurgeon to see if he's even willing to attempt an operation on someone so far gone. We went home that night. The neurosurgeon called us and he said that he was willing to try an experimental surgery to see what could be done for me. But he said, you got to understand there's only 2 possible outcomes. The first outcome is this. He's going to die in the surgery. Or the second outcome is this. I'm going to have to touch every aspect of his brain with a knife, and he's going to be a waterhead. He's not going to be able to walk or talk, and he'll be dead by the time he's 3. I was given a death sentence. Either I die because of the cancer, or I die in the surgery, or I become a waterhead and have no functioning ability until I die at 3. But my parents didn't want to see me struggling with the pain that I was in because it was excruciating. And so they made the decision to attempt the experimental procedure. I went into the surgery, and for 5.5 hours, the doctor worked on me And he worked on me as I sat on a table like this with steel rods in my head, and he worked on me from behind. And as he worked on me, he could see how much, even though I was out, I was struggling and fighting for life. But at 5.5 hours into the operation, I died. So the doctor took off his scrubs and made his way out to tell my parents that I had died. And just as he exits the operating room, he sort of slouches down into a little position on the ground, and he stays that way for a number of minutes. Finally, he rouses himself enough, and he stands up to tell my parents that I had died when a nurse comes out and says, "He's come back to life. Would you like to continue the operation?" He spins around, runs back into the operating room, re-washes, re-scrubs up, and continues to work on me for another 5.5 hours. At the end of that time, he comes out and he gets down on his knees before my mom and he says, "Ma'am, I've done the best I could, but your son will never walk or talk again. There's not one aspect of his brain that I have not touched with a knife." But you see, God is greater than what we understand. God is greater than death sentences. Right now, it feels like this culture is just swimming in a death sentence. But God is greater. The minute I came out from being from the anesthesia, I turned to my mom and I asked for my quacky, which was a little blanket I had from the time I was born until much later in life. Don't judge me. And then I turned to the doctor and I said, "Doctor, how is the transmission on your Jeep? I'm 2.5 years old." The doctor was like, "What are you talking about?" Well, then I started to be able to describe to him the conversations that he'd had and the things that he had done during the surgery. And he said, "How do you know this? I was standing behind you." And I said, "I was watching it from the corner of the room with a bright light." They eventually wheel me over to a window overlooking the doctor's parking area, and I pick out his car on the first try. The doctors were amazed at this, and they thought, wow, maybe this kid's going to have a full recovery. It would be unheard of, but maybe. So they put me into a 2-week recovery, and a day before I'm supposed to go home, my mom is wheeling me around the hospital in a little red wagon, and all of a sudden she notices that my color changes from a really healthy, fleshy color like this to something more gray and ashen and pale. She rushes me back to the hospital room, and when she gets there, when the nurse or doctor tried to pick me up out of the bed, they noticed what looked like brown cottage cheese coming out of the scar from my skull. Another doctor rushed in and he asked my mom how far away my dad was. My mom said, "About 25 minutes. He said, "Call your husband and tell him to get here because your son's going to be dead before that." Come to find out, I had the worst recorded case of spinal meningitis in a 2.5-year-old. Again, another death sentence. They stuck me into one of those little glass rooms that you can only reach into with gloves, and they started all sorts of experimental procedures on me. They found that a couple of ventricles in my brain that keep spinal fluid going over your brain, a couple of them had collapsed, and as a result, they'd had to put an experimental shunt tube into me to keep spinal fluid going over my brain. But so much infection had set in that it had actually curdled my spinal fluid. Well, I didn't die, but as the story goes, I would have spinal meningitis several more times in my life, each time losing the ability to walk and talk. When I would go to school, the kids in school didn't know how to comprehend who I was. I had to wear a giant helmet at times, and I had to wear these big glasses, and it was often said in the schools that if I hit my head, I'd die, and so the students wanted to see if they could hit my head with a stone and if I'd die. It got so bad, the bullying got so bad, that I ended up in Minnesota not taking the school bus to school. I'd actually run to the school, which was about 5 miles away, and in the winters I would run across the frozen lakes by myself as a young child to get to school in time, because I couldn't handle the torment of others around me. In fact, I so badly wanted to be accepted by everyone that at the age of 8, I decided, you know what? I'm going to prove to people that I am actually worth something. And so I decided that I was going to do a wheelie over a manhole cover. I thought a wheelie would be the perfect way of showing people that I had skills and that I could do what needed to be done. And it was an amazing wheelie, let me tell you. But nobody ever taught me how to land a wheelie. And so I decided to do the most obvious thing, which is flip over the handlebars and face plant right into a manhole cover, shattering my skull into my brain. My parents rushed me to the hospital with the call going out, expect dead on arrival. Another death sentence. We get to the hospital and the doctors take an x-ray of my skull and they say, wow, his skull has shattered like a pane of glass into his brain. We need a specialist to come in and get these skull fragments out, but the specialist is on vacation in South Dakota. We're going to have to send a helicopter to go get him. The hospital was also crammed to capacity at this time, and they had no bed for me in order for me to wait. And so knowing this, the doctors told my parents, well, we're going to send him home with you because he'll more than likely die before the specialist arrives. But at least you'll be comfortable while you wait for the inevitable. Another death sentence. My parents would take me home, and for 15 and a half hours, they would take turns watching over me as I lay unconscious in my bed. And about 15 and a half hours in, my mom got really thirsty and she shut off the lights in my room and went downstairs to get a drink of water. And as she was coming back up the stairs, she noticed what looked like a ball of light about 1.5 feet off the floor. And as she looked towards my room, it looked like flames were coming out of the doorway. And so she runs into the room, but all the lights are off. But I'm sitting up in bed and I said, Mom, did you see him? And she said, see who? And I said, he said his name's the same as mine and he's been sent to protect me from now on. My mom was very shocked by this, but the call came in that the doctor had arrived, and so again we rushed back into the hospital. But when we got there, the doctor was like, this kid doesn't look like he's at death's door. Let's take another x-ray. And so they took another x-ray, and 16 hours earlier my skull had been shattered like glass into my brain. 16 hours later, my skull and brain have healed over with no scarring, and I only have this little mark on my head to show for it. At that time, things started to change for me as well. You see, from kindergarten through 4th grade, the teachers realized that I was constantly getting spinal meningitis and it was constantly resetting me. So there was no point in teaching me how to read or write or do anything. I was a waste of space. I was just going to be reset and all of their work was going to be for nothing. And so they never taught me to read or write. Instead, they sat me in the corner of the room and they had me draw mazes or pictures of myself. And I used to draw myself as a pastor standing over the island of Japan. Because even from a young age, I somehow had a desire to do that. Well, as time would go on, I would finally reach 5th grade. And in 5th grade, first day of school, I walk into school and I go to the corner desk where I was accustomed to being. And I sat down and started coloring like always. And the teacher came up to me, the first teacher ever, really. And she came over and she said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm coloring like everyone always has me color. And she says, write your name. And I said, I can't. She said, read this sentence. And she held out a little book to me and I couldn't. She said, if you can't read or write, you're not going to graduate from my class. And she began to work with me every single day on acquiring the skills that others had not felt necessary to impart me with. Because of her, she taught me to speed read. She taught me to do math and writing and all those things, and I was able to catch up to my grade level. God was faithful, but I was beginning to contract a disease more deadly than a level 4 malignant brain tumor. I had contracted the disease of hate. I had contracted the disease of fear of pain. And so, my life began to take shape by these things in my life. I didn't like people. I didn't trust people. I blamed people for everything. But in fact, I really blamed God for everything. But you see, by this time, word was starting to get around that I was a miracle. And so I was being touted around from church to church, whether Catholic or Episcopalian or Assemblies of God or other places, and I was known as the Miracle Boy of Minneapolis. And so I would go in and I would play my part because I knew which side of the bread my toast was buttered on. And I played the perfect hypocrite. I even became a Bible verse memory champion for the Assemblies of God. I would do these scripture sword drills. I knew the Bible better than most people because I figured that was the best way to milk the situation. But I hated God. Then, at 12 or 13 years old, we got a call from the doctor, and he said, listen, you need to come into the doctors again because that shunt tube that we put into you when you were 2.5, if that shunt tube, it goes from your brain down to your stomach where it's voided into your stomach. If that comes out of your stomach, it's going to void into your body. Your body's going to turn septic and you're going to die. You need to come in because we need to start looking at replacing that. Well, during this period of time, I started to have a lot of growth spurts, and not the ones from side to side, but the ones from up to down. And as we went into the doctor's office, the doctor took some MRIs and CAT scans, and he found that I had an inch of shunt tube left in my stomach. And he said, okay, we have to have the surgery the next day. And so we went home that night, and my parents started praying, and my dad prays this prayer of faith, and he says, God, I believe that you can heal my son so he'll never need another operation again. And I looked at my dad, filled with this disease of hate, this disease of fear, and I said, Dad, and I laughed at him, and I said, I only know 2 things. 1, God doesn't exist, and if he does, he doesn't love me. And 2, doctors have all the power. My dad, in his wisdom, got up and left the room without engaging me in that stubborn, rebellious state. And the next day we went in to have the surgery done. Well, the doctor didn't feel quite right about it, so he had us do some more MRIs and CAT scans, and had us then eventually go sit in his office as we waited for him to tell us what the next steps were. Eventually, after several hours, he called us out into the hallway and he said, do you guys see these scans? He said, what do you see? And I was a jerk, and I said, sir, I'm not paid to tell me what I see. And my mom said, I'm sorry, sir, we don't know. What are we looking at? And he said, son, your shunt tube has split in 3 spots and is now curled up like a garden hose in your stomach. He said, I've been on the phone with doctors from around the world for the last 2 hours trying to figure out if this is even possible for someone who's been so dependent on a shunt tube like you, especially the experimental one that we put in you. As far as I know, I'm the oldest living person in the world who's had a shunt tube break and his brain start producing the fluid over his brain again. When I saw this, I went to my mom and I said, Mom, do you think God could heal my eyes? She said, why don't you ask him? So sometime later, I went to a place and I looked up at the sky and I said, God, if you're real, heal my eyes. You owe me. That was my prayer of faith. More prayer of sarcasm. And I went to bed that night and I woke up the next day and there was such intense pain. I knew pain. It was a constant companion of mine growing up. But this pain was just intense in my eyes. And I started to scream. My mom came rushing into the room. She said, oh no, now what? And she rushed me to the doctors, and the doctor starts testing me. And as they're testing me, the pain starts to subside. And I asked the doctor, is there any chance that I can get contacts? Because I'd like to get a girl someday. God would eventually bring me the most perfect woman, but it wasn't because I wasn't wearing glasses. Eventually, the doctor in confusion looked at me and he said, son, I don't know what to tell you. He said, you were blind in your left eye and you had 2400 vision in your right, and now you have practically perfect vision. You don't need glasses anymore. I was stunned, but I thought, okay, God, you've finally given me back. You finally healed me. You've given me back what you stole from me. We're even. You do you, I'll do me. And for the next several years of my life, I would start just focusing on me and focusing on my studies and focusing on basketball and focusing on my body and just trying to live and be the best me that I could be. So, I was out one day practicing basketball with my only friend. Now, I had acquaintances that I knew from school and from other things, but I didn't really like people. This hatred had grown so great in me. I knew people, but I couldn't really like them. And so the only friend I really had growing up, my best friend growing up, was a dog named Judah and a rat named Rascal. And this dog, Judah, My rat rascal had died a year before, and my dog Judah, he was out watching me play basketball. And on this particular day, he stuck his face into a ground wasp nest. And the wasps attacked his face, and his face blew up like a balloon. And here was my best friend, struggling to breathe, struggling to survive, and yet there was so much hatred in me that I thought, hey man, survival of the fittest. You're a dog, you should have known better. And I kicked him. I kicked my best friend. My mom saw me from the house, and she came down and she grabbed me by the ear and hauled me up to my room and threw me in, and she said, "You're not coming out until you meet Jesus." And when she said that, I was like, meet Jesus? Oh, heck no. I was so upset. You see, Jesus to me had stolen my childhood. I wasn't about to bow down before him. And so for the next 4.5 hours, I would rant and rage against God as I systematically would destroy my life. After 4 hours of ranting and raging, I finally fell down on the bed, and I looked to the side between my desk and my bed, and I noticed a book that had escaped my wrath, and it was the Bible. And I thought, oh, this is the book I should have destroyed, but I didn't. And I thought, if I destroy it now, I have nothing to read until my mom lets me out, so I might as well just have some fun and read some of the good stories that are in here. So I started in Matthew, and I started reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And as I was reading it, I started seeing things that I'd never seen before. I started being presented with conundrums that I'd never been presented with before. One of the conundrums that I was presented with was the conundrum of C.S. Lewis, where you have to ask yourself, who is Jesus? Either he's a liar, or he's a lunatic, or he's Lord. If he's a liar, why can't anyone prove him wrong? If he's a lunatic, why are people being willing to die for him for thousands of years? But what if he is Lord? This was something that was presented to me, and I started to wrestle with it. And then all of a sudden I started to notice something that I'd never noticed before. In scripture, it always talked about two groups of people that came to Jesus in these crowds: sinners and tax collectors. Now, tax collectors, I can understand that. Nobody really likes the IRS. But the tax collectors were worse than the IRS. They were traitors to their own country. They would actually steal from their own countrymen in order to give the money to the people that were oppressing them. All for the love of a buck. And the sinners, well, I figured the sinners were everyone else. But finally, I came to realize that the sinners were a separate group of people that were coming to Jesus. And it became apparent to me in a particular passage where it says that there were disciples and Pharisees that would bring people to Jesus and say, whose sin is it that they were born this way? In this particular instance, the disciples brought this man to Jesus and said, whose sin is it that he was born this way? His parents' sin or his sin? And Jesus said it was none of their sin. It was so that the power of God could be made known through their life. You see, when I read that, all of a sudden, for the first time in my life, I heard a voice inside me that just said, Michael. And it woke me up for the first time. And then I came across my favorite story in Scripture. It's the woman with the issue of blood. And here she is, a woman in an honor-shame culture with an issue of blood, meaning she is unclean according to their standards. She's a woman, so she's worth less than a man, but having a medical issue, she's worth less than a man with leprosy. She is the lowest of the low. And by every right, she knew better than to go out and to touch a holy man, because in that culture, unholiness, uncleanliness could transfer to the holy. But she believed that Jesus was more powerful than anything on this earth. And so in faith, she reached out to him and touched just the tip of his robe. And his holiness wasn't dissipated, didn't leave him. Instead, it shot into her and cleansed her and healed her. And she knew instantly that she was healed. And the Bible records the most amazing thing ever. It says that Jesus stopped and searched for her. You see, man has always been wanting to see God. In fact, in the Old Testament, Moses wanted to see God, and God said, "You can't see my face and live." And he said, "You see my backside for a few moments, your face is going to light up like a light bulb." But here we have God in human flesh. And I've been wrestling with, is he really Lord? So if he's Lord, then he's God in human flesh. And he turns and he searches for the lowest of the low. And when he finds her, he says, "Daughter, I've made you well." But you see, when I read it, I didn't read it as daughter. I read it as son. I made you well. Up until this point, I was the one blaming God for stealing my childhood when it was always human error. The doctors at my birth, or the surgeons, or the sicknesses, or the students, or the teachers that didn't take time on me. I blamed everybody else. I blamed God instead of everybody else. I never blamed them. But then I saw that he was searching for me, that he loved me. And so I don't know why I said it, but I said, "God, if you'll finish it for me, I'll follow you." And then I started to see something that I'd never seen before, even though I'd already read it several times. I see Jesus coming before Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate saying, "Don't you realize that I have the power of life and death over you?" And Jesus tells him that if he only knew who he was, that there were 10,000 angels waiting at his back. You see, Jesus could have said one word and he could have wiped out all the Romans, but he didn't. Instead, the Bible records for us that as the lamb is silent before his shearers, Jesus didn't utter a word. I believe that this was one of the greatest temptations of Christ. I believe that as they're punching him in the face, and as they're ripping out his beard, and as they're pounding him with sticks and whipping him with the cat of nine tails, as they're putting this crown of thorns on his head and pressing it down into his skull, as they're mocking him and calling him all these names, he didn't utter a word. And yet I can see all these angels, 10,000 upon 10,000 angels, standing with swords drawn, just saying, "Lord, Lord, why are you allowing these mud puppets to do this to you? Give us the word, Lord, and we'll wipe them out." And he didn't utter a word because he loved me and he loved you. And then we see them take Christ and strip him naked and put him on a cross and nails into his hands and his feet, and they raise him up to mock him. You see, all of that, up until this point in my life, I had said, that's the Romans, that's the Jewish people doing that to Jesus. But now I was seeing it as me. I was associated with pain my entire life. I knew pain, but I also knew the scriptures, and it says that it was for my sins and my iniquities that he was bruised and beaten. He was suffering it for me. I was causing the God of the universe so much pain. And he bore it without uttering a word for me. And I believe that as he was hanging on the cross, the temptation came. You saved others. Why don't you save yourself and prove that you're the Christ and come down off that cross? And in love, Jesus held on to those nails for me, so that he could utter those words at the end, "It is finished," for me. This changed everything for me, and I got down on my hands and knees beside my bed, and I started weeping, and I said, "God, I'm yours. As long as you want me, I'm yours. Whatever you want from me, I'm yours." And in a moment, the greatest miracle happened. I went from being a dead man to being alive. It felt like 10,000 pounds of hatred came off my shoulders, and for the first time in my life, I was able to smile without being forced, and I had a joy unspeakable because I had experienced a love that I could not deny. I had experienced the power of a God who had his way even when it looked like the world was imposing their own will on him. He bore it in his perfect plan for me and for you. Our God is in control. Our God is all powerful. He knows exactly what we're going through right now, and he's not worried. He's the God that never changes, the God of the impossible. So let me encourage you today. Share your testimony of what the God of the impossible has done. It will definitely help other people as you share it, but it will also help you as you remember what God has done for you in the past, because our God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So be encouraged, church. You have been chosen to be loved, and now you have a mission. You have been chosen to be his love to a world that needs it. May you be blessed. Thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.